Before the great powers of our age, before Washington, Moscow, or Beijing, there was another world. A world that thrived on trade, technology, and influence long before the modern nation was even conceived. It stretched across oceans without ever needing armies, ruled through commerce instead of conquest, and left behind echoes in every modern superpower. Its name has been nearly forgotten, but the patterns it created still shape the geopolitics of our world today. This is the story of the Phoenicians, the empire that predicted the global order centuries before it had a name. Its origins, the sea people who owned the horizon. Imagine the Mediterranean Sea around 1500 BCE. To the east, the empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia towered like giants, but between them, along the narrow coastal strip of what is now Lebanon and parts of Syria and Israel, small, fiercely independent city-states began to rise. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, tiny ports carved into rocky shores, facing the sea rather than the desert. They lacked fertile land, great armies, or massive populations. But they possessed something else: access to the unknown. The Phoenicians turned the sea into their empire. They built ships capable of crossing vast distances, developing some of the most advanced naval technology of their time. While other civilizations fought over borders, the Phoenicians mastered what connected them: the waves. Their secret weapon wasn't the sword, but the sail. The network, trade, language, and power without war. The Phoenicians' true genius was not in conquest, but in connectivity. They established trade routes that reached as far as Spain and West Africa, even venturing into the mysterious Atlantic long before the Greeks dared. Everywhere they went, they traded cedarwood, glass, rare dyes, metalwork, and knowledge. They didn't just move goods, they moved ideas. It was the Phoenicians who refined the first true alphabet, a system of writing so efficient that it replaced complex hieroglyphs and cuneiform scripts. The Greek alphabet, and eventually Latin, evolved directly from it. In other words, every modern written language owes something to the Phoenicians. Their innovation turned writing into an accessible tool for merchants and diplomats, not just kings and priests. This made trade faster, contracts enforceable, and long-distance commerce possible, the foundation of global economics. They created the blueprint for globalization, nearly 3,000 years before the term existed. The empire of color, purple in the price of power, their wealth flowed from a single color: Tyrian purple, a dye extracted painstakingly from thousands of sea snails, became the symbol of royalty and divine power across the Mediterranean. So rare and costly was this color that only emperors could afford it. The phrase "born in the purple," used centuries later by Byzantines, came from the legacy of Phoenician trade. But this dye did more than color robes. It dyed the structure of power itself. As the Phoenicians grew rich, other empires, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, became their clients, allies, and sometimes enemies. They paid tribute not with gold, but with access, trade routes, naval intelligence, and resources that could shift wars without spilling blood. The Phoenicians were early masters of soft power, a strategy modern superpowers use today through trade agreements, technology exports, and cultural influence. The rise and fall of the first global empire. Around 800 BCE, the Phoenicians founded a colony in North Africa. They called it Kort Hadasht, New City. The world knows it as Carthage. From a coastal outpost, it grew into one of the most powerful cities in history. Carthage controlled Mediterranean trade, commanded vast fleets, and challenged even mighty Rome. Its harbors were engineering marvels, capable of housing hundreds of warships in secret. For centuries, Carthage represented a new kind of power: corporate, mercantile, decentralized. It was a maritime superpower built on contracts rather than conquests. Its influence stretched from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the islands of Sicily and Sardinia. But its very success made it a threat. Rome, hungry for dominance, could not coexist with a power that controlled the flow of goods and gold. The Punic Wars that followed were not merely battles between armies. They were wars between two economic systems. Rome represented the centralized state, Carthage the networked empire. When Carthage finally fell in 146 BCE, The Romans destroyed it so completely that they claimed to have salted the earth. But they also absorbed its systems: maritime law, trade networks, and finance. The DNA of Carthage lived on, not in ruins but in Rome itself. The legacy: how the Phoenicians predicted globalization. Centuries passed, but the Phoenician model never truly died. Their decentralized, trade-based empire prefigured the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, the East India companies, and eventually the global corporations that define our modern age. They proved that influence could travel through contracts, not conquest, through networks, not nations. Theirs was a world where economic power transcended geography, and where information, like their alphabet, could be the most valuable export of all. In a sense, the Phoenicians invented the first global system, a web of trade, finance, and communication that echoes in everything from modern shipping, routes to the internet's invisible networks. Their empire collapsed, yes, but their ideas became the architecture of every empire that followed. Modern relevance: the digital Phoenicians. Today, our world is ruled not by armies, but by flows of data, currency, energy, and attention. Global corporations move across borders with the same agility as Phoenician traders. Tech giants control networks instead of navies. Trade agreements define peace more than treaties do. Soft power, through culture, branding, and influence, often decides wars before they begin. In many ways, Silicon Valley and Wall Street are the new Tyre and Sidon, modern ports of wealth, knowledge, and control. The algorithms that shape our lives today are simply digital versions of the ancient trade routes that once carried purple dye and papyrus. The Phoenicians might not recognize our ships or satellites, but they would recognize our ambition to connect, to profit, and to endure. Reflection: the empire that never died. Perhaps this is why their story still resonates. The Phoenicians never ruled through fear. They ruled through relevance. Their empire was not carved in stone, but written in the habits of humanity, in our need to trade, communicate, and seek value in connection. When we talk about globalization, about the invisible ties that bind nations together through commerce and technology, we are echoing a pattern older than history itself. In the end, the Phoenicians didn't disappear. They evolved into the systems that shape our world, into the empires that now command the seas of data instead of water. Their world ended, but their idea that power lies not in land but in links became eternal. The cost of connection. When trade becomes dependence, every empire built on trade eventually faces the same paradox. The network that connects it also exposes it. For the Phoenicians, their mastery of the sea created opportunity, but also vulnerability. The wealth that flowed through Tyre, Sidon, and Carthage was irresistible to rising powers. As the Assyrians expanded across Mesopotamia, they demanded tribute from Phoenician cities in exchange for survival. When Babylon rose, it followed the same pattern. Later, Persia absorbed them into its empire. But wisely, it allowed Phoenician merchants to continue their trade, recognizing that destroying them meant killing the very system that enriched everyone. Trade had made them indispensable, but dependence on the network meant their freedom was always conditional. This is a pattern that echoes through time, from colonial mercantile systems to modern supply chains. The same roots that enrich a nation can also enslave it. The blueprint of empire, from Tyre to Silicon Valley. When the British Empire expanded centuries later, it unknowingly mirrored the Phoenician model. Naval dominance, strategic ports, economic diplomacy, the ability to project influence through commerce rather than occupation. The East India Company was essentially a reincarnation of Carthage, a private empire with its own fleets, currencies, and laws. In today's world, global corporations have inherited that mantle. Apple, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft move across borders with their own rules, shaping economies and policies through access rather than force. Their servers are modern ships. Their code, the new alphabet. The Phoenicians taught the world a fundamental truth. Whoever controls the flow of information controls the future. The alphabet once linked markets. Now algorithms link minds, but the principle, the power of connection, remains unchanged. The eternal trade, human ambition, and the sea. The sea has always been the great equalizer. For the Phoenicians, it was both a highway and a sanctuary. a space beyond the reach of kings. They could outmaneuver empires because they didn't belong to any. Their ships carried silver from Spain, tin from Cornwall, and gold from Africa, but they also carried something less tangible. The idea that freedom comes from movement. Every modern entrepreneur, trader, or innovator who defies borders echoes that same spirit. The Phoenicians lived by a simple creed, and prosperity belongs to those who move faster than power. That idea still defines our world, from financial markets that trade billions in seconds to startups that disrupt entire industries overnight. The Phoenicians didn't just build ships. They built the psychology of globalization, the mindset that opportunity exists beyond the horizon. Lessons for a fractured world. But every network eventually faces stress. The same interdependence that made the Phoenicians powerful also made them fragile. When Rome cut off their trade routes, their empire collapsed overnight. Today, as global systems strain under political conflict, trade wars, and digital monopolies, the same vulnerabilities are returning. Our world depends on invisible networks of supply, finance, and data that can fracture just as easily as the Phoenician sea routes did. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. The story of the Phoenicians reminds us that connection can be both salvation and curse. When the pursuit of influence becomes an obsession, even the most connected empire can drown in its own web. The silent legacy, writing on stone and silicon, the alphabet the Phoenicians spread became the written DNA of civilization. It simplified communication, democratized knowledge, and accelerated the exchange of ideas. Today we live in another alphabetic revolution. Digital language. Binary code is the new Phoenician script, connecting billions across continents, shaping commerce, culture, and consciousness. Like the merchants of Tyre, modern coders and engineers are building invisible bridges. Each keystroke, each algorithm, is part of a global dialogue that transcends nations. The Phoenicians may have faded from maps, but their vision never died. It simply transformed, from parchment to pixels, from ports to platforms. The myth of the endless empire. The idea of an empire without borders is seductive. The Phoenicians believed they had found it, a realm of endless trade and eternal wealth. But no system escapes the gravity of history. As their cities fell, their language evolved into others. Their gods were renamed, and their legacy scattered across cultures. Yet even in disappearance, they achieved something extraordinary: immortality through influence. Carthage's ashes became Rome's foundation. Phoenician letters became Greek. Their gods were reborn as Roman deities. Their technologies resurfaced in Venice's shipyards and Lisbon's docks. Empires fall. Ideas migrate. That is the true lesson of the Phoenicians. Permanence does not come from monuments or armies, but from the systems we leave behind. The circle closes, and from sea to sky. Thousands of years later, satellites trace the same paths the Phoenicians once sailed. Invisible trade winds of data circling the planet. Where their ships carried cedar and silver, our networks carry currency and code. Where they mapped coastlines, we map consciousness. The world they dreamed of, borderless, connected, profitable, is finally here, but so are its dangers. As we stand on the edge of digital empires, the question remains: will we master our networks, or will they master us? The Phoenicians would understand that balance, and perhaps they would smile. They too built something vast and beautiful, until it slipped beneath the tide. Closing reflection. The first globalists. In the end, the Phoenicians were not conquerors. They were connectors. They wove the first global web, not of machines but of minds. Their world has long vanished, yet their vision defines ours. An interconnected planet driven by exchange, shaped by symbols, ruled by those who understand that power is not about possession, but about flow. The next time a ship leaves harbor, a plane crosses the sky, or a signal travels across the globe, remember that somewhere, 3,000 years ago, a Phoenician merchant stood at the edge of the sea, staring at the same horizon, dreaming the same dream. The dream of a world without borders, the dream of connection, the dream that built the future.